My daughter-in-law said, "You stuff your mouth but lift no finger like a parasite in this house." After I paid every tax, fixed every repair, and gave them free accommodation, my son still said, "It's just easier if you let Nicole decide." They wanted to erase me from my own house, so I showed them whose name was truly on the deed. The morning light filtered gently through the faded floral curtains, spreading a soft glow across my kitchen. I moved slowly, deliberately, as I cracked eggs into the skillet, placed bread into the toaster, and let the smell of coffee rise to fill the room. This was my rhythm, a ritual that had carried me through widowhood, through lonely evenings, and now through mornings in which I was no longer seen as the heart of this home. Nicole entered without a word of greeting, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen of her phone. Her voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the kitchen's calm. "You stuff your mouth but lift no finger like a parasite in this house." For a moment, the sound of sizzling eggs felt louder than her words, echoing in the silence that followed. I tightened my grip on the spatula, not from fear, but from the effort it took not to answer. My eyes stayed on the pan, though inside, I felt her words searing me more deeply than any flame beneath the skillet. Kyle sat at the table, his laptop open, fingers tapping in a distracted rhythm. He looked up briefly, as though he might speak, but then lowered his eyes again, as if silence could shield him from the conflict unfolding inches away. His quiet cut me more sharply than Nicole's insult. I placed the plate of eggs and toast in front of him anyway. Old habits die slowly. He murmured a thank you without lifting his gaze, the words hollow, an afterthought, rather than gratitude. Then I felt a small tug at my dress. Emerson, my granddaughter, wrapped her little arms around my waist, pressing her face into me, as though to hide from the tension she could not yet name. Her innocence both soothed and broke me. She, at least, still saw me, still sought my warmth. I placed my hand gently on her head, steadying both of us. I moved to the sink, rinsing my ceramic mug beneath the steady stream of water. The mug was cracked slightly along the rim, a scar from years of use, but still, it held strong. My late husband had given it to me on one of his birthdays, insisting that the best gifts were the ones that lasted. I looked at Nicole's back as she leaned against the counter, scrolling, sneering, as if the roof over her head had appeared by magic, as if the meals she ate and the warmth she enjoyed came without sacrifice. Kyle kept typing, pretending the house was not cracking beneath the weight of unspoken words. I did not reply to Nicole. My face remained calm, my movements precise, as though her insult had not lodged itself into my chest. But inside, my voice grew sharper, stronger, no longer begging to be heard but readying to be declared. I have given too much to be treated as nothing. I set the mug carefully on the counter and turned back to the room, silent, but a decision already beginning to form in my heart. After the plates were cleared and the kitchen returned to its silence, I slipped away. The living room greeted me with its familiar hush, the morning sun filtering through the blinds, streaking the carpet with golden stripes. On the coffee table lay a manila folder. I pulled it closer, its edges worn from years of being tucked away in the drawer beneath my books. The single word written on the front in my late husband's neat handwriting seemed almost to pulse at me. Deed. I sat down heavily on the sofa, the folder resting on my lap. For a long while, I simply stared at it, my fingers tracing the crease. It was not merely paper. It was history. It was proof. It was my anchor. Slowly, I opened it, the crisp rustle of pages echoing in the quiet room. Inside were the documents, all in my name. Not Kyle's, not Nicole's, mine. I looked around the room, the walls painted in warm beige, the old photographs lining the mantel. Every corner held a memory of sweat and sacrifice. I thought of the countless property tax bills I had paid on time, year after year, even when money was tight. The roof that had leaked during a storm 3 winters ago, I had been the one who arranged the repair, dipping into my savings to cover the cost while Kyle claimed he was too stretched with other responsibilities. When he had been between jobs, it was I who quietly slipped extra dollars toward groceries, electricity, and the internet he depended on. But to Nicole, none of that mattered. To her, I was only the old woman who consumed food, who lifted no finger. She had not seen the years of invisible labor. Or perhaps she had chosen not to see. My gaze fell again on the deed, and my mind traveled backwards. It was 1986. My husband and I had sat at a long wooden table at the bank, pens poised nervously as we signed the mortgage papers. I could still hear the scratch of his pen, his little chuckle afterwards. Well, love, now we are truly tied down. I had laughed, though my chest was swelling with pride. That evening, neighbors had helped us haul second-hand furniture through the doorway. The rooms had smelled of fresh paint, hope, and exhaustion. It was not just a house then, it was a dream stitched into bricks and mortar, the day of his death. The silence in the house was so heavy, it pressed against my lungs. I remember sitting on this very sofa, wondering how walls could still stand, when the man who had filled them with life was gone. When Kyle and Nicole's financial troubles arrived, I had opened the door. I told myself it was temporary. They need a hand, I had reasoned. This home is big enough for all of us. I imagined it would bring closeness, that I would be part of their rhythm, not merely a shadow in it. But time revealed another truth. They had not seen it as my generosity, but as their entitlement. Nicole moved through the rooms, as if they had been gifted to her by fate. Kyle, my own son, acted as if his silence was neutrality, but his silence was an alliance. Slowly, I had become a ghost in the very home I had built. I lowered my eyes to the deed again. The ink faded slightly, but still strong. There it was, my husband's signature beside mine. The sight of his handwriting felt like a whisper from another time. I touched it lightly, my fingers trembling. This was ours, I whispered, the words barely audible in the empty room. It still is mine. The truth was heavy, but it was also clarifying. I realized then that I had allowed myself to disappear. I had permitted my own erasure in the name of peace. But this folder in my lap, it was more than a legal claim. It was a reminder that I was not powerless. I had simply forgotten how to wield my own authority. The deed was no longer just paper. It was my weapon, my shield, my proof. And soon, it would become the voice I had been denied for too long. The afternoon light slanted across my bedroom floor, painting long strips of gold across the carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed, the manila folder still fresh in my mind, its weight lingering in my chest. For years I had folded myself small in this house, trying to keep the peace, trying to believe silence could keep love intact. But silence had only fed their arrogance. I reached for the phone on my nightstand. My hand did not shake, though I felt my heart thudding against my ribs, like a fist knocking from the inside. I scrolled down to the number I had looked at 100 times, but never dared to call. Then, slowly, I pressed it. A woman's voice came through, warm and professional. Camille, Realty Services. How can I help you today? I drew a long breath and answered, my tone steady. Yes, I'd like to list the house. And there was a pause, the kind that stretches as someone rearranges their thoughts. Then Camille spoke again, her voice softer. Are you sure? Selling a family home isn't easy. My lips curved, not in a smile, but in the grim certainty of a wound that had healed wrong. It's time. Her reply was practical, brisk. She spoke of market value, appointments, paperwork. I listened. I agreed. But her words were only a hum in the background. For me, the decision had already been made long before the call. This was not about buyers or listings. This was about reclaiming a voice that had been smothered beneath years of entitlement. After I ended the call, I went to the closet. From the back, behind winter coats and boxes of forgotten linens, I pulled out an old suitcase. Its handle was worn, the zipper stubborn. I set it on the bed and opened it wide. I packed lightly, not as though I were leaving my life, but as though I were stepping aside, just long enough to watch it unfold. 2 dresses, folded with care. My husband's sweater, still holding faint traces of the cologne he had once worn. And finally, my ceramic mug, cracked but unbroken, wrapped gently in a scarf. That mug had survived every season of my life. And it would survive this one too. The act of packing felt like rehearsal, for a departure I had rehearsed in my heart many times. I did not plan to vanish, only to step away, to stay with Margaret during the open house. Margaret, my old friend from church, who still laughed too loudly and baked pies that smelled of cinnamon and mercy. She would open her spare room to me without question. As I zipped the suitcase, doubts crept in, like shadows at dusk. Would Kyle think me cruel? Would Emerson feel I had abandoned her? My chest tightened at the thought of her small arms around my waist, her trust in me unshaken, even when her parents' words turned bitter. But I forced myself to look at the truth squarely. Nicole would never learn gratitude if I continued to bend. Kyle would never learn strength if I continued to shield him. And Emerson would never learn respect if I allowed myself to be treated as invisible. Sometimes lessons are the only form of love that works. I placed the suitcase by the door and sat back down on the bed. The room was quiet, the air heavy, yet I felt lighter than I had in years. The betrayal that had once eaten at me was no longer an open wound. It was hardening, reshaping itself into resolve. The decision was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, like the first step across a bridge. But I knew this. The house, the life, the respect that was mine would no longer be stolen silently. Friday morning carried with it a strange stillness, the kind that hides before a storm. I had already polished the dining table and opened the curtains wide when Camille arrived, professional in her dark blazer, a neat camera bag slung over her shoulder. She greeted me with a smile, but her eyes, sharp and perceptive, lingered just long enough to suggest she understood there was more to this than business. Nicole's heels clicked against the hardwood as she entered, phone in hand. Her brows shot up. "Why is there a stranger with a camera in here?" Before I could answer, Kyle looked up from his laptop at the breakfast table. His voice was flat, dismissive, as though the whole matter bored him. "Mom must be updating paperwork. Refinancing, maybe." I gave them both a vague smile, wrapping my words in softness so they could not pierce. "Just some options I'm considering," I said, as though the thought carried no weight at all. Camille moved through the house, snapping pictures of the sunlit living room, the neat bedrooms, the garden outside. I followed her, answering her quiet questions, while Nicole hovered, arms folded, suspicion sharp in her gaze. But she said nothing more. She thought I could see that this was another one of my little whims. By late afternoon, the truth stood in bold red and white in the front yard. The sign hammered into the soil was impossible to ignore. "For sale." I stood at the window, watching, as neighbors slowed their dog walks, pausing to read, to whisper. Phones buzzed across the street. Curtains shifted. Suburbia had always thrived on gossip, and I had just handed it a feast. Inside, I heard Nicole's voice rise suddenly. A ping on her phone, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "I saw your house is listed. Moving?" The message from her friend burned her cheeks crimson. Her embarrassment curdled into anger, and she stormed into the living room where I sat with a cup of tea, steam curling upward like smoke from a quiet fire. "What kind of joke is this?" she demanded, her words snapping through the air. I lifted the mug to my lips, the ceramic warm against my skin, and took my time before answering. "I'm exploring possibilities," I said evenly. She let out a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow. "Exploring possibilities? You're not thinking straight. You're senile. That's what this is." Her words carried the sting of dismissal, the kind meant to shrink me back into silence. But I did not shrink. I let her words fall between us like stones into water, rippling, but not sinking me. And in that silence, my mind betrayed me with memories. Nicole mocking my cooking not long after she moved in, wrinkling her nose at my stews and casseroles. So old-fashioned. No wonder Kyle never ate well growing up. I had laughed then, too politely, though my hands had trembled at the sink. Then the day she redecorated the living room, pulling down my floral curtains, without so much as a question, replacing them with gray panels she called modern. I had come home from the store to find the house altered, my home turned into something colder. No trace of me left, and the worst wound of all being excluded from their family trips. They had gone to the mountains one winter, to the beach another summer. Each time, I was left behind under the excuse of babysitting Emerson, while their laughter filled photographs I was never meant to be part of. I had smiled in the pictures they showed me, but inside I had felt erased. Nicole stood before me now, her hands on her hips, certain of her place in the world, certain of her victory, but she did not know what I held in my heart. What folder lay safe in my room? What strength I had quietly gathered? I sipped my tea slowly, my eyes steady on hers. My patience had been tested, layer upon layer, chipped away, until nothing was left but resolve. This was no joke, no whim, no senility. This was the beginning. The night had folded itself over the neighborhood, the houses glowing with the soft rectangles of television light. My own backyard was cloaked in stillness, broken only by the quiet rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. I knelt on the damp earth, pruning the roses, the faint scent of them clinging to my hands. The garden had always been my sanctuary, the one place that did not shift with Nicole's moods or Kyle's silences. The soil responded only to patience, the blooms only to care. There were no raised voices here, no sneers, only growth, only persistence. As I clipped a stubborn branch, I remembered my husband's voice, gentle and steady, as if he were leaning over my shoulder even now. "This garden will outlive us both," he had once said, smiling as he pressed a seed into the soil. At the time, I had laughed and brushed him off, telling him nothing lasts forever. But tonight, as I touched the thorned stems and inhaled the perfume of the roses, I felt him in the night air, his words proving themselves true. The garden had indeed outlived him, and in some way, it had outlived me too, for I had become invisible inside the house. But out here, I was still myself. From the kitchen window, faintly lit, I heard their voices. Nicole's sharp hiss, cutting through the walls like a blade. What if she's serious? Her fear was not of losing a home, but of losing face, of being humiliated before the friends who whispered and texted behind her back. Kyle's reply was softer, almost weary. "She's just trying to scare us. Mom wouldn't actually go through with it." He wanted to believe in my weakness, because it kept his own spine intact. To admit I was serious would mean admitting he had ignored me all along. Nicole's voice rose again, bitter, shrill. "Do you know how this makes me look? People are asking me if we're moving. They're laughing, Kyle. Laughing at me." Her rage was about appearances, never about truth. I pressed my hand into the soil, grounding myself against their voices. They saw me not as the woman who had built this home, but as an inconvenience. Nicole saw me as an obstacle to control. Kyle saw me as background noise, the wallpaper of his life, useful but unnoticed. Even Emerson's love could not mask the truth that in this house, I had been diminished into a shadow. But out here, in the garden, I was not a shadow. The roses stretched toward the moonlight, their roots deep, unmovable. They reminded me of what I had always known. Survival comes not from loudness, but from endurance. My husband had been right. The garden outlived us, because it knew how to root itself, how to withstand storms. I bent low, whispering to the blossoms, my words carried away on the night breeze. "Tomorrow, everything changes." The sentence felt heavier than the soil, heavier than the years of silence I had endured. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the pruning shears down. But it was not fear, it was anticipation. Tomorrow, the open house would not only expose walls and rooms to strangers, it would expose the truth that had been buried beneath years of disrespect. I rose slowly, brushing the dirt from my knees, and looked toward the house. Its windows glowed faintly, a place of tension and unspoken bitterness. But the garden behind me stood serene, its roots strong, its blooms unbothered by human quarrels. The house could be sold, walls could be stripped, curtains replaced. But the garden, my garden, would always hold me, remind me of who I was. And unlike Nicole's shallow entitlement, unlike Kyle's silence, my presence here could not be erased. Sunday arrived with a sky so clear, it almost mocked the storm brewing inside my walls. The morning sun poured over the street, catching on windshields as cars began to line the curb. Neighbors lingered at their fences, some with mugs in hand, pretending to be casual while their eyes stayed fixed on my yard. The red and white for sale sign seemed to burn brighter in the daylight, impossible to ignore. Camille arrived promptly, her presence composed and efficient. She carried a leather folder under her arm and wore a smile polished by years of open houses. "Welcome. Come in," she greeted the first couple who stepped up the path. "This is a beautifully cared for home." Her voice rang warm and professional, but to me it sounded like a hymn, a song of recognition for the care I had poured into this house, long before anyone else dared to claim it. One by one, potential buyers moved through the rooms. They admired the framed photographs in the living room, the polished dining table, the roses in the backyard. I watched from the hallway, listening, as Camille's words painted me, not as a burden, but as a caretaker. "The owner has tended to everything," she said, gesturing to the spotless counters. "This is a house filled with history, but it's been maintained with great pride." Nicole's heels struck the floor like thunder. She pulled Kyle into the corner, her voice lowered but frantic, sharp enough to slice through the hum of polite chatter. "She can't be serious," she hissed. Her face was blotched with anger, her phone clenched tight in her fist. Kyle rubbed his temples, his expression lost, a man caught between denial and dawning fear. "It's probably some mix-up," he muttered. She wouldn't really," but his voice lacked conviction, as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Nicole did not wait for proof. She stormed into the middle of Camille's tour, her voice rising above the polite murmur of buyers. "This isn't for sale," she snapped, gesturing toward me. "There's been a mistake. She doesn't know what she's doing." Heads turned. The air stilled. Camille blinked, caught between professionalism and confusion. But before she could answer, I stepped forward. My hands did not shake as I opened my folder and drew out the manila envelope. I placed the deed in Camille's hand. The papers crisp. The ink undeniable. "This," I said clearly, my voice carrying through the room, "is my decision." For a moment, silence settled, broken only by the faint click of a camera, as one buyer snapped a photo of the garden through the window. Then came the whispers, the exchanged glances. Neighbors pressed closer to each other at the doorway, their faces alight with curiosity, their murmurs like leaves rustling in a storm. Nicole flushed red, the color rising all the way to her hairline. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The embarrassment was too raw, too public. Kyle's face went pale, his lips parting as he looked at the papers in Camille's hands. For years he had assumed the house was his future, assumed his mother's sacrifices were just duty, assumed he would inherit without ever asking. Now the truth stood bare in front of him, undeniable. And he looked smaller for it. I held myself tall, steady as the roses in my garden, while the world around me shifted. For the first time in years, I was not invisible. They all saw me now, not as background, not as a burden, but as the woman who held the deed, the power, and the will to use it. The kitchen had become a stage, though I had never invited an audience. Buyers drifted in from the hallway, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting from me to Nicole, from Nicole to Kyle, as if they had stumbled into a play they had not bought tickets for. Nicole's voice erupted first, sharp and venomous, slicing through the quiet hum of strangers. "You've betrayed us, after all we've done." Her hands trembled as she jabbed her finger toward me, her face twisted, her cheeks blotched red. A murmur rippled across the room. The buyers exchanged glances, some lowering their voices, others leaning closer, hungry for the drama. Kyle stepped forward, his expression strained, his voice breaking under the weight of fear. "Mom, please," he pleaded. Think about Emerson. His words hung heavy, as if invoking his daughter's name would sway me back into silence. I stood still, my hands resting on the counter, my breath steady. For years, I had allowed others to speak for me, over me, against me. Not today. My voice rose, calm and unhurried, but with a strength that filled the room like a tide. I paid for this house, I said, each word measured. I raised you here. I opened it to you when you needed help. I kept the taxes paid, the lights on, the roof over your head. I have cooked, cleaned, and carried burdens you never even saw. My gaze locked on Kyle's, then slid to Nicole's, unflinching. And still, you called me a burden. But the truth is, you have been living on my generosity, and today, that ends. The words landed with a silence louder than any scream. Nicole's mouth opened, then closed again, her face contorted with fury, but no words came. For once, her sharp tongue failed her. The humiliation was public, inescapable. Her anger melted into a kind of stunned collapse. A woman stripped of her assumed power. Kyle's eyes were wide, his face pale, as if he were seeing me for the first time, not as the background of his life, but as its foundation. He looked as though the floor had shifted beneath him, his certainty crumbling like plaster. And then a small sound. Emerson, standing at the edge of the kitchen, her little hands twisting nervously. Her eyes were wide, fearful, and then she rushed forward, burying herself in my arms. I bent down to my knees, holding her close, her soft hair brushing my cheek. You'll always have a place with me, I whispered, my voice low enough for her alone, though I knew every ear strained to hear it. She relaxed against me, clinging tighter, as if I were the only solid ground in the room. The buyers who had lingered exchanged looks that softened into sympathy. Some smiled faintly, their expressions saying more than words. Could they saw me, not as a bitter old woman taking revenge, but as someone drawing a line after too many years of silence. I rose again, Emerson's hand still in mine, and looked around at the faces, neighbors, strangers, witnesses. Let them talk. Let the story spread. For once, the story would be true. My revenge was not cruelty. It was justice. Nicole was silenced. Kyle was awakened. And Emerson, my sweet granddaughter, was protected. The balance had shifted. And this time, it shifted toward me. Monday morning unfolded gently, sunlight spilling through Margaret's lace curtains, touching everything with a softness I had not felt in years. Her home smelled of cinnamon and old books, a kindness wrapped in walls. I sat at her kitchen table when the phone rang. Camille's voice came clear, professional, but tinged with excitement. We've received multiple offers, she said, all above asking. I let the words sink in, a small smile forming. I did not give her an answer, because this was no longer about selling. Not really. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine. The right to choose, to hold authority, to be seen. That afternoon, a knock at Margaret's door. When I opened it, Kyle stood there, shoulders slouched, his face hollow with shame. For a moment, he was no longer the man who had let Nicole's voice speak louder than his own. He was just my boy, looking lost. I should have defended you, he said, his voice rough, eyes downcast. I let Nicole's voice replace mine. His words carried weight, but they did not erase years of silence. I listened, my heart heavy, but steady. Then I spoke, clear and unwavering. If you want me in your life, Kyle, it must be on terms of respect, not convenience. He nodded slowly, the truth pressing down on him harder than my anger ever could. He left without protest, and for once, I did not feel the ache of being unseen. I felt the strength of being unyielding. Later, I returned to my garden. The roses greeted me in full bloom, their petals wide and fearless. I carried my ceramic mug, the small crack along its rim catching the light, a reminder of endurance. I bent to tend the soil, my hands steady, the earth cool and grounding. Then I stood and looked at the house. The same walls, the same roof, but no longer a burden pressing against my chest. Instead, I saw legacy, built with love, preserved with sacrifice, defended, at last. I raised the mug to my lips, the taste of coffee rich and warm, and whispered into the quiet air. The house was always mine. Now, they know it too. All my life I thought love meant silence, that keeping peace was the way to hold a family together. But silence can turn into erasure, and generosity into entitlement, if you allow others to forget your worth. Standing up for myself was not about anger, it was about reclaiming dignity that should never have been surrendered. If you are in a season where your sacrifices feel invisible, remember this. Respect is not asked for. It is enforced by the boundaries you set. If this speaks to you, tap like, subscribe for more grandma revenge stories, and tell me in the comments which moment made you feel strongest.